All right. So today we're going to be discussing how to scale at the team level and also at the org level. We're going to talk about team composition and also about different things you need to do to scale up when you have multiple squads, multiple teams working. Okay, so the first thing that is a good topic is, do you have full stack engineers, right, that do a little bit of everything that's needed? Or do we have a composition of expertises? I have worked on different combinations. I have worked in combinations that I had a mix of like platforms, like we had like engineers that are really experts and would only code on a single code base. They would not cross boundaries, right? The iOS engineers would only work on the iOS code base. The Android engineers would only work on the Android. Same for the backend, same for SRE, even though SRE had a more cross role. But what I would say, based on my experience, especially if you're starting with a small org, I would say that at the beginning, I think it would be beneficial to start with having more people that are more generalists. And then as you start to run into problems, then maybe you can create platforms or teams that are more experts on the domain, but that would be probably way down the line. And the advantage that I see is that if you have a lot of people that are like highly flexible, and even though they don't have the full expertise, they're able to like knowledge share, they're able to do pairing, they're able to collaborate across whatever is needed and work across the product. And if you're starting a brand new org or a brand new product from the ground up, usually those are the engineers that are needed to start something from the ground up, because you don't know exactly what kind of like expertise you need, right? But then after you are stable, maybe having some experts and leverage them to build frameworks and things for the more generalist ones might be super helpful.
Yeah, I agree with you that especially with an early product or when you're just figuring something out, it's good to have people flex across back end, front end, maybe a bit of mobile if that's what you need, and just able to do a little bit of everything to like piece something together. But I do think that's, even if you're working on like new products in a company, like that becomes more harmful than helpful in my mind, because there's not much time between we're hacking something together to let's productionize this and get this out to customers, especially at a startup. Like you have something good, you want to get it out ASAP, and then it's a lot of context building, a lot of going back and like fixing things that you just like put together, or a lot of going back and trying to figure out like what assumptions you made in building this prototype version, and now does it actually work the way we want it to. So I feel like it's a good skill to have, but the teams that I've seen be the most successful are ones where you have experts who are familiar enough with the other areas they're not experts in to speak to it and work with someone. Like a very experienced backend engineer can definitely work with a very experienced front-end engineer to build something, so they can like speak the same language, but they're experts in their field. So you can still build quickly, but you're not so much hacking it together.
I think this reminds me of the T-shaped engineer, right? So you want engineers to be able to go broad in general, but also be able to go deep in one or two areas of expertise. So there are some benefits to being a multi-skilled engineer. So it makes you a better, well-rounded engineer. You get to take on more responsibility because of your breadth. And Petra pointed out, you can work with different teams. You have a better understanding, and you could show more empathy because now you understand the crap that some of the other teams are going through. And you might have more compassion, not just throw something over the wall and say, okay, it's your mess now, you deal with it. You can also cover them if they are away or on vacation, or if you are on call and you are stuck with an issue. If you have an understanding, you could dig around or at least figure out where the issue lies. And this also makes you more employable, right? Especially early on in your career, if you are jumping every 2 to 3 years, the added skill set will enable you to be more employable. So how do you become a T-shaped engineer? So maybe take your time initially to understand your depth, your area, and spend some time with other team members, looking in other code bases as well. And again, go do things that you are uncomfortable with, keep learning, and take your time while you get there. Maybe I wanted to ask the panelists, is there a difference between what kind of teams work well? Do you prefer SRE or DevOps embedded in a team? And what team size works well? I've heard about the 2 pizza teams. I've heard of the 4+1 team. So 4 software developers, 1 test engineer, plus 1 SRE, sometimes a Scrum Master is included. I just wanted folks to share what teams they've been a part of or they've found are the most efficient for a given project.
So I'm a huge fan of team sizes being roughly like 4 to 5 people, like excluding the EM. Like you end up basically with something like 1 to 2 junior engineers, a staff engineer, or multiple staff engineers and a principal. Sometimes the principal's not even on the team, right? They may be like above the team, working across multiple teams. I find that kind of ratio allows the junior engineers to get quite a bit of bandwidth from everyone else, where they're not yet like the team is not spending so much bandwidth training them, and they're able to learn from a wide mix of people. And also, and you'll notice that I didn't mention any SREs or anything like that there. And I think that's because I have found that when you have people with dedicated skill sets like that embedded on the team, and okay, so I've seen supporting roles, right? Like you end up with a sponsor SRE that ends up maybe supporting 3 or 4 different teams, and then they have enough stuff to do. Whereas if a person's full-time job was really supporting this one team, they run out of stuff to do. And instead, I prefer an approach where you have engineers on the team that decide to develop expertise in those areas. So if you will, like something like a team of T-shaped or M-shaped engineers, I found that I really enjoy working with. You end up with a very high-performing team where everyone is able to unblock themselves. Oh, the builds are not working, and you don't need to go find the CI/CD team. You know, I know why the builds are not working. That's like a Circle CI config or whatever, a Jenkins config that like I've encountered before I can fix. Or, you know, our Kubernetes pods keep dying and we can't figure out why. You don't go try to figure out in the SRE room unless you can't handle it. It ends up being like, let's anyone want to watch me do this? You tail into the servers and you look up the logs and you go, oh, this thing ran out of memory. And here's how you figure out like how this is happening. Let's create the alerts for it. And you end up with a team that like is able to depend on each other and not be completely dependent on like resources outside the team, and they become helpless. So I really like when these expertises are built, these proficiencies are built within a team. And of course, that doesn't mean that SRE is jobless, right? SRE and your infra teams are still building all the infrastructure and setting up the tooling that allows teams to be able to, enabling these teams and providing them the tooling to be able to help themselves. So it's not like there's no point of SRE anymore just because the team has developed these proficiencies.
I have different opinions on this. I think it depends on the scale, right? If we're starting a brand new company today, what do we think? Where do we think it's going? Like, for example, I remember when Jet started, I was in pretty early, maybe 20 engineers in there. We had 1 iOS developer, 1 Android developer, and they were building the app in parallel. We had a bigger web team using Node as the backend for the front end or whatever. And then we had a bunch of backend teams building a bunch, 2-3 people teams building various aspects of the distributed system. We knew the thing was going to scale. We had raised way too much money and we had to hire people down as things were progressing. And so we structured probably from day one with the anticipation of fleshing out these teams. And it worked out really well, but we got lucky to a certain degree. It's lonely being one developer on the iOS app or whatever it is. And I used to go to lunch with the guy once in a while. And ultimately, by the time we got acquired, he maybe had 20 people under him. But it was a very interesting time. And seeing all of that sort of play out And I think what you're saying about DevOps and SRE, I think they're always going to have things to build. They're always going to have tooling that other teams, that's maybe even libraries sometimes, right? I saw that team take over this area where we had a common backend, and they owned sort of the team that would build maybe a shared logging library, or we were building in F# at the time on the backend. So a lot of things didn't even exist there. So they had a lot of work to do there. And then they also, obviously, they had a team that was dedicated to CI/CD, to all these other things, to Azure, which had its own problems. But all of us were still forced to learn a lot of that skill set, because these people, the funny thing about DevOps is like, they're always busy. Like, it's really interesting. Like, they always have way too much, and teams have to pick up where they can. But anyway, I saw all of those things flesh out over time, and it worked out wonderfully to have these sort of dedicated teams. But if I didn't anticipate that the thing was going to be big enough, Jet was selling $1 billion worth of goods a year by the time we got acquired. And that's a lot of GMV for let's say if we said the whole company was going to be worth a couple of million, then maybe it makes a whole lot more sense to have the Android and iOS team working together, and maybe they build some common libraries across the two apps, or they can use one of these cross-platform things, or maybe they even start touching their own backend, their own APIs to get into the broader system. And they're in that way, they're a little more full stack. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But I think scale dictates a lot of things. Like, where the worst thing is when companies don't know they're going to scale and they build in a way that is difficult later, because then you need to redo large chunks of it.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that example, because I think it's actually at the beginning, and if you're building like apps and web and all that, I think is usually better to have one iOS, one Android, at least to get enough demand, enough of the MVP to have more people helping. The problem though that happens maybe after 100 people is that if you have one Android engineer on each one of the domains, they might not have enough work. Or if you have a central team of iOS and Android, everyone will depend on them to launch things, right? And they start to become a bottleneck, and it starts to be a dependency hell, right? And I think that's the problem that I see on having those, let's say, islands of like expertises. But the challenge though, when you have to 100 engineers plus, is more, how do you scale that in a way that a lot of the T-shaped engineers can go and build something end to end without actually, or most of the time without actually needing support from expert? Because otherwise you create a huge backlog of things for those engineers to build, and they don't have the domain context, right? It's like almost they're working along their expertise and building things like as a factory, and the backend engineers are writing APIs ahead of time for them to integrate, right? And then it becomes like almost like a war, like in the sense that it gets engineers frustrated, and they get, oh, we should do this different, but they are not able to maybe propose solutions because they're not working on those code bases. And then like, it's almost like you no longer have what they call stream aligned teams, like a team that is fully independent and is able to deliver everything that's needed for that particular domain in the app. You have like half-baked group of people that are like just trying to prioritize work and working against almost like a dependency. And the same becomes a problem when you have DevOps teams, right? And then you need to set up something. They are the only ones that not only know how to do, but the only ones that have permissions how to do.
Yeah, I agree with your thing that you're talking about, like silos, right? When you have dedicated, by the way, it's going to sound like I'm on one side, I'm going to go to the other side. When you have these teams that are dedicated back end and dedicated front end, right? What happens is we need to build feature X, and you either need to have a very detailed architecture diagram, which, becomes necessary at a certain scale anyway for people to know and track dependencies. But what happens is you end up with this large architecture. Okay, we need to build component X. And so you end up with basically a front-end team that works in parallel with a back-end team. They all agree on here are the APIs we need. And unless they have a culture of constantly shipping and integrating their work, they don't find out until quite a ways away that they've built slightly different things. And then they integrate and they go, oh, our UI actually needs slightly different inputs, slightly different responses from the API, and they're still working very much in a silo, right? However, what I find and I have found is that when you have a full stack teams don't develop expertise in a domain the same way that dedicated teams do. What I mean by that is that when you have a dedicated front end team, in my experience anyway, what happens is they set up front end guilds and they like will go and discuss topics like how do we do state management, React or whatever. And they'll like watch conferences together and they become quite experts at like that. And then you have the backend developers who similarly will have like guilds for their languages and they get expertise at that. And I have not seen that happen with full stack teams who I don't know if either they believe that and I've been part of this group where I basically was like, all right, I already know full stack. I already do front end and back end. I don't need to really learn anything else. Or in full stack teams, you end up not really acquiring that level of expertise, which sort of makes sense, right? Because this all sort of has to do with your startup size and the maturity of the organization. In the beginning, you have a small number of people and you need to ship something. And you have, let's say, 10 people and you want generalists who are going to help you ship this product. And you don't have the money to pay for 2 dedicated teams to be able to help you ship all this stuff. But you get far enough in your organization and your startup survives and is no longer pre-revenue. And then you realize that we need expertise here. We need to bring in like AI experts. We need to stop just calling the ChatGPT API using full stack people. You're going to bring in your ML experts. You're going to bring in your dedicated backend experts to tune the garbage collection and Go. You're going to bring in your front end experts to, I don't know, do something else. And at that point is when you grow into a large enough size that you end up with the dedicated teams. So I do think it has a lot to do with your startup age and maturity and where in the revenue cycle you are.
I think it's what you said made me think of a few different things. I probably will forget half of them on the way, but I think what you find if you are separated by like function, invariably you keep creating like tiger teams to go after projects or ideas or that you need to address like a big bug that's come up. Like you can't get something done with a team made up of just one function. You really can't when it comes to shipping to the business. Maybe if you're like a very, I don't know, internal tool for developers and it's like truly like mainly backend work or something like, I don't know. But I think for the most part and most engineering teams, you need some sort of mix up. I do think though, it's a benefit to engineers as they grow in their careers to not get too siloed into one area of working. That can be back end, front end, be a language or a certain framework that you work in. I remember we were interviewing for senior backend engineers, and there was one person we interviewed. He was a backend engineer through and through, but he had also, because he'd been at the same company for 10 years and it was like a small company, he was only familiar with their framework and their built very niche language. I can't remember what it was right now, but he genuinely had no exposure to anything else. And that made him a very hard candidate to hire for. He could have been extremely smart, extremely good at all the other parts of engineering. But if you put yourself into this niche too early and don't expose yourself, you're hurting your future opportunities.
One of the things at Jet that was just thinking back, Walmart ran things very differently. So I'm sort of able to contrast how they structured e-commerce versus how we structured e-commerce. And the Jet app was, again, started by one person, and ultimately later on they hired more people. And one of the downsides of having sort of an iOS app, an Android app, and a web app that has different teams is that inevitably they won't all be at the same feature level. Like sometimes the iOS team might not have enough people, and so they don't add that feature just yet. And this happened. But what also happened is that our iOS app was incredible. We won awards because we had this one team that was like specialized and they loved that thing and that's all they cared about. I mean, we literally won awards from Apple and we were a small startup. And so it was very nice to be featured and all of that. And then what's really interesting, the web is a little bit tougher because Big said we needed internal tools, we needed other things built so all of this has trade-offs. So Walmart, what they did is they did the exact opposite. They had the cart. One team owned the entire cart vertical, and that cart was huge, a massive code base of Java. And so now the trade-off is not getting something into the cart. You get something into the cart, but what if it's got to integrate with search or the product listing page that another team owns across these other, and they all have, so no matter what, you're making these trade-offs. I mean, there's no real way to it's just which trade-offs do you want to make. And for us, I think on the web development side, we have a lot of internal apps that were we didn't have a lot of Android. We only had one Android app and one iOS app. That was the core e-commerce platform. But internal tools and other tools that we needed, like we needed a tool for merchants, that was a web app, and that was a separate team that had that. And that team was more full stack. And so they still aligned on libraries, and the core front end team made a lot of decisions, and they shared where they could. But the core front end team for e-commerce was focused on that. And it's got trade-offs. Like I said, I contrast that with Walmart, where everything that ended up on cart went through the same team. And when you had to have features span across these domains, it was much more difficult than just having the iOS team take care of it. You had to go to 5 iOS teams or whatever it was, and a few backend teams at that. Of course, Walmart's much bigger, right? Massive code base, much bigger than Jet, but still, I suspect they had to make similar trade-offs to get there.
I agree with the number of trade-offs that we've had to make. I think one other trade-off, especially let's say you have a dedicated iOS team, a dedicated Android team, and a dedicated web team, is lining up releases. So if you want to have one feature rolled out on the 15th of the month, there are different hoops to jump through. For example, Apple has to approve your iOS app, and sometimes Apple will take 8 days to approve your app, and sometimes it'll take 8 hours. And it's completely unpredictable. So with the Android, in my experience, it's usually quicker, but again, there is no SLA that your app will get approved in good faith within a day or so. So now if you have web teams that have worked their ass off to meet this deadline, and the mobile teams met the same code cutoff deadline, there is added process to get Google to approve the Android app, Apple to approve the iOS app. How do you manage to make sure that the feature is turned on for your customers on the same day at the same time? One option that we've used in the past that works well is using something like Launch Darkly or Optimizely or some sort of feature flag, so that you can still deploy to production. All your code is still there, but it's all in a turned off state. And then once you have your mobile apps approved, your web code is in, you just flip all the flags together and the functionality lights up all at once. I'm curious to see if there is other trade-offs that folks wanted to share.
You might have a bunch of, let's say, iOS engineers going on vacation at the same time. So you have a location problem. Then iOS might always be behind. So that's another thing you have to, and then you have to move people across, and they lose the sense of belonging, and they don't know that domain. So even though they know iOS, they might not be familiar with the pay bill flow. But I feel if I could see a natural evolution is, I think first what Louis said, you start with a shared service team where you have this group of, let's say, dedicated to one platform, right? And for a while, they are not a bottleneck. So all they're doing is the iOS app, all they're doing is the Android app, right? And then you go to the next move, that is you spread them out across the domains, right? So you put one iOS engineer on each one of the squads you have. And then you run into another problem, that is, if you only have one expert team, you still need, and you might have more work in one side than the other. You run into the next issue. And then I think the next evolution of that is you leverage the experts to build platforms that are easy enough or like high level enough for that particular company, that particular domain, that most, let's say, T-shaped engineers are able to leverage those platforms to launch things across the platforms without knowing all the details, because everything is being built at the platform level, right? And because those T-shaped engineers work across, you might have one that can go a little deeper in one kind of problem. And whenever a new capability is needed, they partner up with the platform iOS or the platform Android, and they build things at the platform level exposing to everyone else to use it. You don't have this, let's say, experts working on the code base, you have them working on the platform. Vic?
You mentioned the word vacation. So I will say, like, when you have a sort of a full stack team, right, that's made up of an iOS person, an Android person, a backend person, a front end person, if that one person goes away, you've effectively basically lost the ability to do that work. As opposed to a team of dedicated specialists, they are able to balance on call. They're able to, if you have a full stack team that gets paged, it's effectively everyone's getting paged, as opposed to when you have a dedicated team that's getting paged and you have like a person that is able to, sorry, not just paged, but also when someone wants to go on vacation, the load is spread across the rest of the team. Which is my preference for like having like dedicated teams, but people that want to get deeper into some other area. Yeah. Louis, I saw you smiling. I want to know why.
I think people should be able to take vacation without impacting the team. But I think really that's a managerial problem for the most part. I don't know that obviously it could be like you don't have enough people, but I don't think that's one of the trade-offs. Like I still think you can work vacations even regardless of which path you go here. But it just depends on if you can find enough. If you don't have enough iOS devs, you're screwed no matter what. It doesn't really matter how you divide the few you have. Anyway, yeah.
You have a team of one iOS dev. It doesn't matter. Can they take vacation? No, they can't take vacation anymore.
Also, if there's a talk or a conference that all the iOS developers want to attend all at once, then you are screwed again. But it completely depends on the team topology at that point. So maybe we should shift gears a little bit and talk about fostering culture within the teams as well. I guess it depends on the size of the team, and the skill set is one, but also maybe if somebody wants to touch on how many levels is ideal to go up to let's say the CEO or the CTO. I've read white papers saying no more than 7 layers to the top and no more than 7 individuals directly reporting to you. But a lot of that can be refuted based on the size of the company, the stage of the company. Startups might structure teams very differently. And one other thing I wanted to maybe touch on is if you are introducing a new team topology, how do you deal with the emotions? Because there is often a lot of resistance if you, as a leader, are trying to introduce a new team topology because you think this is what will work best. You have your reasons, but folks are often change averse. They are resistant. They think things are going well or good enough. Why the change?
Yeah, I think going back to your first question of how many levels is correct and how many people should report to you, it's like the context is all in the company, like you said, like number of people, and I'd say even type of company. But I think what we often forget is if all of those like levels of managers went away, the company could still probably run. But if all the engineers and the people actually who do the work went away, there would be nothing to run. And so I'm always really interested in seeing, especially like startups or smaller companies, like how they like constantly add in like VPs or heads of or directors when you're so small. It's like adding another layer, and it's really hard to point to the value that layer adds when you don't have that many people to manage or that much to manage. And so it's, in my mind, keep it as flat as you can for as long as you can. Obviously, there are benefits to having middle management. I mean, I'm part of that, so I can speak to this. There's benefits to it, but you also don't want to add it unnecessarily. And I think we're seeing that in this economy, right? That's the first layer to go, because it's really hard to point to like immediately the value can provide. There is a lot of value, but it's felt over a long period of time. And related to that, I think it makes managers' jobs really difficult if you have a ton of reports, because their primary job does not become furthering someone's career as it should be and helping people grow. It becomes just managing what their teams need to do. And then the team is the afterthought. And then you lose people. And there's a lot of resentment around you as a manager that you didn't do, your job correctly. As long as you can handle not just like making time for one-on-ones weekly, but actually spending time on someone's career and actually understanding what they're doing week to week, whatever that number is for people, I think is the limit, and it's different per person.
That's a great point. I think that there was also studies done on how many individuals within a team, and if there's two teams interacting, at what point does communication start dropping through the cracks and teams start being ineffective when working towards a common goal. Basically, there is a point to which increased collaboration increases productivity, but after that, just the cost of communication or collaboration amongst that many members within the team or with extended teams starts to take a toll, and productivity is starting to plummet. Agreed. So if you have dedicated skill set within a team, you can still have a staff engineer, principal engineer for, let's say, an iOS developer, as opposed to full stack, but then their scope of responsibilities are a lot broader. Would you treat these any differently given their skill sets, or they are still contributing towards the same project, so they should be treated the same?
What do you mean by treated?
In terms of the path, the career path, would you still go from a junior to intermediate through senior? And would the timelines be the same for, let's say, a DevOps engineer or a SRE engineer versus a full stack engineer? And do those timelines vary?
In a weird way, right? Companies that are small enough to have only full stack teams don't ever kind of like have that kind of leveling. If you have a team of 10 people and you have one large full stack team, you don't do like staff and principal and all that, right? I have, however, seen a Tiger team set up to be able to handle, like, we have this crucial project. These things are a roller coaster, right? You start off with a small full stack team, and then you're going to set up multiple dedicated teams. And then you realize that now you're shipping too slowly because everyone, like, no one knows what's going on in terms of like your projects are taking too long. And then you form a Tiger team out of people that you remove from every project. And now you end up naturally with a full stack team that ends up having this kind of hierarchy of, oh, we have a junior iOS engineer, and we have a staff backend engineer, we have a principal engineer, we don't know what that person does, and we have another staff front-end engineer. And that is sort of I feel like that's a temporary situation when you get to that Tiger team area, because these people, they're learning from each other because what pure exposure to other engineers, but they're not really like getting the same kind of growth opportunities that you would in a dedicated team, just because the way you measure people with similar skill sets becomes different, right? Like you will say something like, well, I'm just making this up now, a junior SRE needs to suggest improvements in the process. A senior SRE takes improvements in the process to an SRE function and implements them. Staff SRE looks at, like, what systems reliability needs do we have, and suggests and writes the SDD for it that is then handed off to whatever, and then your principal. So these things, like, just, I feel like, work differently at the sort of like, how do you grow stage. However, yeah,
I think the implications of the career ladder and the levels, right, I think are huge. If you have a lot of different expertises, it ends up being more challenging to identify the boundaries and to also evaluate that, because if you have a much smaller groups of experts, it's really hard to have levels. But the other thing, I was actually going to go back to one of the things Keir was saying, like the limit of direct reports. Or so we talk about, okay, how many levels on the organization can you have to be effective, to be able to drive things to completion? And there is another thing that I find often, that the limit of how many direct reports one manager can have is not necessarily on the number of people, but on the number of projects and how hands-on the manager needs to be to hands-on. I don't mean coding, but like to unblock things, to get things running. Because often, if you have more than 7 engineers, you're probably going to have a few tracks of work happening, right? You no longer have one thing going. You have two, three, and often one of those things are going to be like on red, and you as a manager are going to need to spend a lot of time doing deep dives and trying to understand till you actually get that one on a good shape. So that's why I say the limit is if you're able to scale the projects and the people on the team were like good enough or not good enough, but they had everything lined up and there was no problems on projects or problems with conflicts, I think you could handle probably more than 10 people. The problem is that the expectations for engineering managers feel that you are still responsible to help the team to deliver, not only help to grow careers, but also help the team to operate, help the on-call if like crashes are happening, right? Incidents are happening. And that's often is a more constrained element of the managing more people than direct like career conversations and one-on-ones and all that. I feel that's probably the easiest part. And if you're like 100% people manager, you are able to have maybe 15 people, but as you need to help to debug projects and to get them moved, that's where the constraint appears.
I think it also depends on the industry and amount of red tape involved within the industry. Sometimes managers responsible for getting approvals for deployments or begging release managers for permission to deploy because there is a no deploy period, or there is a Black Friday or Christmas coming up where no one is allowed to touch deployments, but you really need to get some fixes out, and half their life is spent chasing approvals and writing effectively and efficiently to summarize why you need to have this deployment or why it's important and why you need an exception to the rule. So I agree. Ideally, 7 to 8 direct reports is what general recommendations say. But to your point, it depends on how many production incidents you are pulled into, how many fires you're fighting at the same time. I think it also depends on whether the teams you are managing are working on different projects and with different product managers, because then that also increases your friction or willingness to work with different mindsets with different deadlines. So the cost of context switching is a lot higher for you because you have multiple things on the go, multiple deadlines that might miss. You're trying to keep everything above water. And to me, what Mitra said, you still have to make sure you're having your one-on-ones, you're still prioritizing the career and truly understanding where your direct reports want to grow, right? That does take a lot of time and mental capacity to make sure you prioritize that in good faith.
I would say the other thing is like, how hierarchical is the organization? Because if you're super hierarchical, you need managers for everything, right? And how much red tape you have, right? Because managers need to fill the gaps. The other thing, so there is the famous book called Team Topologies, right? That came out maybe 3-4 years ago with the idea of 3 different collaboration type and 4 different models of how teams operate, right? You have what is the traditional product or domain oriented, it's called stream aligned, right? Is aligned to an area or to a mission, right? And is responsible for a business outcome that is platform, that is like enablement, and that is, but I think the question I have is, have you guys actually used that and talked in that terms, or is more theory and in reality you don't really work that way? I have found to be really challenging to go beyond product and platform, and I don't see many enablement and what is the other one, the complicated business like platform domain. Actually, I do. If you really go, there are probably some platforms that are more complicated subsystem, but more curious to know like how you guys see that on your companies and experience.
I'll be honest, I have seen some platform teams. This is especially true when there are monoliths that we are supporting. So it usually takes a long time to know all the business knowledge or domain knowledge that's accumulated over 15, 20, 30 years. And these teams are solely responsible for keeping the lights on. This is the bread and butter for the company. And even as you start modernizing your stack, even as you start taking out chunks from the monolith, there is still enough work to be done to make sure that you're constantly doing your upgrades, you're staying on top of your security fixes, making sure that you're chipping away tech that you accumulated 10 years ago. So that's one instance where I've seen dedicated platform teams work really well because they know the domain inside out and they are able to quickly respond to any issues that arise and upgrades that need to be done. Other than that, I'll be honest, I've had a hard time going past what is shared in the book, especially because it varies greatly between company to company on how they started off and where they ended up. Trying to make big changes top down is often very hard and often has a lot of resistance and requires buy-in from a lot of stakeholders before they can be adopted. Okay, I think we can wrap it up for today. Thank you, everyone. We will see you all back in a week. Take care.